Picture this. You're sitting in your warm house right now, probably with a refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen, maybe a freezer full of food that'll last you months. You flip a switch, artificial winter appears, and your meat stays fresh indefinitely. Now imagine all of that disappearing. Forever. No electricity, no refrigeration, no grocery stores. Just you, your family, and whatever food you can preserve before winter kills everything you didn't manage to save. That's exactly where we find ourselves in the winter of 872, after Christ, in the fjords of western Norway. But this isn't just any winter. This is what the Norse called a wolf winter, one of those brutal seasons that separates the living from the dead with all the mercy of a sharpened axe. In the longhouse of Eric Bloodaxe, and yes, that was actually his name, earned through 30 documented kills in battle, young Ragnar watched something that would have broken most of us completely. His sisters, children who should have been playing and laughing, were growing thin as shadows. Not the kind of thin we might worry about today, but the gaunt, hollow-eyed thin that meant death was coming for dinner. The irony? They had meat. Eric Bloodaxe was no pauper. This was a successful warrior, a man who commanded respect and resources, but their carefully stored winter provisions, the meat they'd worked so hard to preserve, had turned green with rot. And when you're facing a Norse winter, we're talking about temperatures that would make a modern Canadian shiver. Eating spoiled meat isn't just unpleasant. It's a death sentence. Eric himself, this giant of a man who had survived 3 decades of medieval warfare, now lay dying from the very food that was supposed to sustain him. Poisoned by meat gone bad, his body racked with fever, probably suffering from what we'd recognize today as severe food poisoning. But in 872 after Christ, they didn't have medical terms for it. They just knew the food was cursed, and the curse was spreading. Think about this for a moment. Here's a man who had stared down shield walls, who had felt enemy blood spray across his face, who had earned his nickname through sheer brutality, and he's being killed by dinner. The wind howled through the smoke hole above them, carrying with it the promise of months more winter, and Eric Bloodaxe knew he was running out of time. But dying warriors sometimes carry the most important messages. As his fever burned and his strength faded, Eric gripped his son's hand with whatever power remained in those battle-scarred fingers, and he whispered something that would change everything. Stories he'd heard from Eastern traders, men who travelled routes we can barely imagine today, who spoke of something they called white gold from the sea. This wasn't literal gold. This was something far more valuable in a world where winter meant death. The traders claimed this white substance could keep meat fresh through 2 full winters. 2 winters. In a world where most families considered themselves lucky if their meat lasted 2 months, this sounded like magic, like the power of the gods themselves. That night, as his father lay dying, Ragnar made an oath that would echo through history. This wasn't just a promise, this was blood binding in the truest Norse tradition. He mixed his blood with his father's, the warm red liquid mingling in a cup, while the wind outside promised death to anyone foolish enough to venture into the storm. And he swore, by all the gods his people feared and honoured, that he would find this secret or die in the attempt. Now, when I say die in the attempt, I want you to understand something about medieval travel. This wasn't hopping in a car for a road trip. This was strapping on weapons and walking into territories controlled by people who would kill you for the clothes on your back. The journey east that Ragnar planned would take him through the territory of the wolf clans, and yes, they were exactly as pleasant as they sound. But grief and desperation make men do extraordinary things. Ragnar set out with nothing but his father's weapons and a determination that bordered on madness. The wolf clans controlled the eastern passages, and they didn't negotiate. Their champion, Bjorn Skull Splitter again, these names weren't chosen for their subtlety, had never lost a fight. Never. This was a man who collected the heads of his enemies and wore their finger bones as jewelry. What happened next sounds like something from a saga, but remember, these sagas were often based on real events, just told with the kind of dramatic flair that made them memorable around a fire. Ragnar challenged Bjorn to single combat. Not because he was brave, necessarily, but because he literally had no choice. The wolf clans would never let him pass otherwise, and going around their territory would add months to his journey, months his village didn't have. The fight itself was brutal and brief. Medieval combat wasn't the choreographed sword dancing you see in movies. It was desperate, bloody, and usually over quickly. Ragnar killed Bjorn's skull splitter, earning not just safe passage, but something almost as valuable: respect. The wolf clans recognized courage when they saw it, even from an enemy. But the real discovery came at the salt marshes beyond Uppsala. Here, in a landscape that looked like the edge of the world, Ragnar found something extraordinary. Ingvar the Preserver, last keeper of ancient Roman knowledge. Think about this: the Roman Empire had fallen centuries earlier, but scattered individuals still carried fragments of their advanced understanding. Ingvar was one of those living libraries, a man who understood principles that wouldn't be rediscovered for generations. The knowledge Ingvar shared was both simple and revolutionary: the sacred proportions. 1 part, salt to 4 parts meat, packed in oak barrels sealed with pine tar. That's it. No complex chemistry, no elaborate rituals, just salt, meat, and the precise ratio that could preserve food through 2 full winters. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Ragnar didn't just learn a technique, he learned why it worked, how the salt drew moisture from the meat and created an environment where deadly bacteria couldn't survive. He learned about the importance of the containers, why oak was better than other woods, why pine tar created the perfect seal. This wasn't just preservation, this was science, passed down through generations of Roman knowledge keepers. When Ragnar finally returned home, carrying his newfound knowledge like the most precious treasure, he discovered something that would have crushed a lesser man. When Ragnar finally returned home, carrying his newfound knowledge like the most precious treasure, he discovered something that would have crushed a lesser man. Half his village was dead, not wounded, not sick, dead. The winter had claimed them while he was away, just as it had claimed countless others across the Norse lands. The survivors who greeted him were walking skeletons, their eyes hollow with the kind of hunger that changes people forever. But here's where the story gets interesting. Ragnar had brought back more than just knowledge. He'd brought back preserved elk meat, real, edible, safe meat that had survived the entire journey. When he opened those oak barrels sealed with pine tar, the smell that emerged wasn't the sickening stench of rot that had killed his father. It was the clean, salty aroma of perfectly preserved food. That elk meat lasted through spring. Let me put this in perspective for you. In a normal year, maybe 20% of a Norse village would die during winter. That was just accepted reality. But Ragnar's preserved meat saved 60 lives. 60 people who should have been corpses became the foundation of something extraordinary. Word spread like wildfire across the Norse lands, and when I say wildfire, I mean it moved with the desperate speed that only life-saving information can achieve. Imagine being a village chief and hearing that someone had figured out how to cheat winter itself. Wouldn't you want that knowledge? Wouldn't you do almost anything to get it? Within 5 years, the rumor had become legend, and legend had become something worth killing for. The Battle of White Stones erupted when 5 Jarls think medieval warlords united for the first and only time in recorded history. Their target? Ragnar's salt sources. These weren't minor chieftains scrapping over a few fishing boats. These were the big players, men who controlled territories the size of modern counties, and they were willing to risk everything for the secret of preservation. The mathematics of the battle tell the whole story. 5 Jarls brought 1,000 warriors to seize what they thought would be an easy prize. After all, what could one village do against such overwhelming force? But they hadn't counted on something revolutionary. 300 salt warriors, men and women who had been eating preserved meat rations all winter long. Think about this difference. Traditional Norse warriors in spring were weak, hungry, probably suffering from what we'd recognize as malnutrition. They'd survived winter, barely, on whatever scraps they could find. But Ragnar's people? They were strong. They were well fed. They had energy reserves that their enemies couldn't match. It was like sending a modern army against medieval soldiers. The technological advantage was that dramatic. The battle lasted 3 days. 3 days of the Jarls throwing wave after wave of attackers against defenders who just wouldn't break. By the end of the second day, something extraordinary was happening. The attacking armies were literally too weak to fight effectively. They were starving, exhausted, operating on empty stomachs, while facing enemies who were eating preserved meat between battles. On the third day, the Jarls retreated. 5 of the most powerful warlords in Norway, commanding 1,000 warriors, defeated by 300 villagers with full bellies. It wasn't tactics or superior weapons that won the day, it was nutrition. It was the simple biological reality that well-fed people can outfight hungry people every single time. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. This wasn't just about one battle. This was about a complete transformation of Norse society. The revolution that followed changed everything about how these people lived, fought, and survived. Women like Astrid Silverhands became master preservers, developing techniques that went far beyond Ragnar's original elk meat. We're talking about sophisticated preservation methods for fish, seal, and whale protein sources that could feed entire communities through the worst winters. These weren't just housewives, experimenting with recipes. These were skilled technicians developing industrial-scale food processing techniques centuries before anyone else figured out how to do it. The sacred salt house rituals emerged from this revolution. Imagine entire communities gathering for what we might call preservation festivals. When autumn came and the great slaughter began, the annual killing of animals before winter, these weren't chaotic, desperate affairs anymore. They became organized, ritualized events where hundreds of people worked together with military precision. They invoked Njord of the sea and Frey of the harvest, turning preservation into a religious act. And why wouldn't they? When you've discovered something that can save your children from starving, something that can keep your community alive through months of deadly cold, that feels like divine intervention. That feels like the gods themselves have shared their secrets with mortals. The children who would have died in previous winters, kids, like Ragnar's sisters, who had wasted away to shadows, now grew strong enough to become warriors themselves. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about creating a generation of Norse fighters who had never known the weakness of winter starvation. Imagine the psychological impact of that. Imagine growing up knowing that winter couldn't kill you. Trading towns exploded around salt markets with the kind of rapid growth that makes modern urban planners dizzy. Hedeby, which had been a modest settlement of maybe 200 people, grew to 5,000 in a single generation. 5,000. That's 25 times larger, all because people could now rely on preserved foods to survive winter. Merchants from across the known world began showing up, eager to trade for these miracle preservation techniques. But success breeds jealousy, and in the medieval world, jealousy breeds violence. The Salt Revolution was about to face its greatest test, as enemies emerged who would rather see the entire system burn than allow others to benefit from it. The mathematics of survival were about to become the mathematics of war, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. By 900 after Christ, something extraordinary had happened. Ragnar's grandson, Ulf Saltblade, and yes, these names keep getting better, commanded fleets that raided from Iceland to Constantinople. We're talking about a maritime empire that spanned half the known world, and it was all built on one simple foundation: the ability to keep meat fresh at sea. Let me give you the mathematics that changed everything. One preserved ox could feed 10 warriors for a month at sea. Think about what that means in practical terms. Traditional Viking raids were limited by how much food the ships could carry and how long it would last. Most expeditions had to turn back after a few weeks, not because they lacked courage or weapons, but because they were literally running out of a brief, things to eat. But with salt preservation, suddenly, you could plan expeditions that lasted months. You could strike targets that were previously impossible to reach. You could overwinter in enemy territory, living off your preserved supplies while your enemies starved in their own lands. It was like upgrading from a motorcycle to a tank, same basic concept, completely different capabilities. The monastery at Lindisfarne learned this lesson the hard way. Now, Lindisfarne wasn't just any monastery. This was one of the most important religious centres in medieval England, protected by its island location and the assumption that winter weather would keep raiders away. For centuries, that assumption had been correct. Vikings might raid during summer, but they always had to leave when the cold weather came. Except Ulf's forces didn't leave. They established a base nearby and lived through the entire winter on salt, cod, and preserved whale meat. Imagine being a monk in that monastery, watching smoke rising from Viking camps month after month, knowing that come spring, these weren't going to be weakened raiders desperate to get home. These were going to be well-fed warriors who had spent the winter sharpening their weapons and planning their attack. When spring came, Lindisfarne fell not to superior numbers. The Vikings were actually outnumbered, but to something the defenders had never faced before. Enemies who were stronger in spring than they had been in autumn. It wasn't tactics that won the day. It was nutrition. It was the simple biological reality that preserved meat beats empty stomachs every single time. But the real game-changer was Ulf's 30-ship expedition to establish the Greenland settlements. This is where the story gets almost unbelievable. Except we know it actually happened because we have the archaeological evidence. Greenland. Think about that destination for a moment. We're talking about sailing to one of the most inhospitable places on Earth and establishing permanent settlements there. With traditional food preservation methods, this journey was literally impossible. The distance, the weather, the complete lack of local food sources, it would have been a suicide mission. But with oak barrels full of salt-preserved provisions, suddenly the impossible became merely difficult. Ulf's expedition could carry enough food to survive not just the journey, but the first crucial years of establishing new settlements. This wasn't just exploration, this was the creation of the first truly global food distribution network. From bases in Greenland, Norse expeditions would eventually reach North America, 500 years before Columbus, and it all came down to salt. It all came down to Ragnar's desperate journey to save his dying village. But success this dramatic always comes with a price, and in the medieval world, that price was usually paid in blood. The Salt Wars erupted when jealous Jarls realized they couldn't compete with Ulf's preserved meat advantages. If they couldn't match his technology, they would destroy it entirely. The poisoning campaign was insidious and effective. Trained agents infiltrated preservation facilities and contaminated salt supplies with arsenic. Not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough to kill slowly and horribly. Hundreds died, their bodies racked with the same symptoms that had killed Ragnar's father generations earlier. The irony was bitter. The technology that had saved so many lives was being turned into a weapon of mass murder. The massacre of the Preservers represents one of the darkest moments in this entire saga. By this time, Ragnar's bloodline had become legendary across the Norse world. They were the keepers of the preservation secrets, the master technicians who could teach others the proper ratios and techniques. They were also, unfortunately, a very obvious target for anyone who wanted to destroy the salt preservation revolution. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. All of Ragnar's surviving descendants were invited to a grand peace feast at Uppsala, the most sacred site in the Norse world. This wasn't just any dinner invitation, this was a formal ceremony, backed by religious oaths, designed to end the Salt Wars peacefully. Representatives from across Scandinavia would attend, and everyone would swear binding oaths to respect each other's preservation rights. It was also a lie. Trained assassins had been positioned throughout the feast hall, waiting for the signal. During the third course, and remember, medieval feasts had elaborate rituals around when certain foods were served, the killers struck simultaneously. Within minutes, Ragnar's entire bloodline was dead or dying, their preservation knowledge apparently lost forever. Except for one person. Ragnar's daughter, Freydis, had arrived late to the feast, delayed by a storm that probably saved her life. When she saw the carnage inside the hall, she did the only sensible thing. She ran. Not just away from the immediate danger, but away from Norway entirely, carrying whatever preservation knowledge she could remember to Iceland. The Salt Wars had achieved their immediate goal. 40% of Norse salt production was destroyed, either through direct attacks or because the master preservers who understood the techniques were dead. For a few years, it looked like the enemies of preservation had won, like the old ways of winter starvation and seasonal raiding would return. But they had made one crucial mistake. The knowledge had spread too far to stop. From Dublin to Kiev, Norse raiders and traders had already carried barrels of salt-preserved goods and the techniques to create them. The revolution had grown beyond any single family or bloodline. It had become unstoppable, and it was about to transform not just the Norse world, but medieval civilization itself. Though Ragnar's direct lineage ended in blood at Uppsala, his innovation had already done something extraordinary. It had transformed the medieval world. By 1000 after Christ, every major European power was using Norse preservation techniques. The technology that began with one desperate father's dying words had become the foundation of medieval logistics, warfare, and trade. The Bayeux Tapestry, that famous embroidered record of the Norman conquest, shows us something remarkable if you know what to look for. Those Norman invaders crossing the English Channel, they're carrying barrels. Lots of barrels. And those aren't filled with ale or weapons, they're packed with salt-preserved meat, prepared using methods that descended directly from Ragnar's teachings centuries earlier. Think about what this means. William the Conqueror's invasion of England succeeded partly because his forces could carry preserved provisions that wouldn't spoil during the crossing or the campaign that followed. The Battle of Hastings, one of the most pivotal moments in English history, was influenced by preservation techniques that originated in a desperate Norse village during a wolf winter. But the story gets even bigger. When Columbus set sail for the New World in 1492, his ships carried salt cod, prepared using preservation methods that were virtually identical to what Ingvar the Preserver had taught Ragnar 5 centuries earlier. The discovery of America, the opening of global trade routes, the transformation of European civilization, all of it built on the foundation of keeping meat fresh at sea. The Hanseatic League, that powerful confederation of merchant cities that dominated northern European trade for centuries, grew rich primarily through one commodity: preserved fish. Their techniques for creating and transporting salt-cured herring were directly traceable to Norse innovations. German merchants in Lübeck were using preservation ratios 1 part salt to 4 parts fish that Ragnar had learned in the marshes beyond Uppsala. But here's what I find most fascinating about this entire story. In modern Norway, archaeologists have discovered something that brings the whole saga full circle. The Trondheim Salt Storage Complex, perfectly preserved after 1,000 years, still contains traces of salt mixed with herbs in the exact proportions Ragnar learned from Ingvar. Let me repeat that. After 1,000 years, longer than the entire history of most nations, we can still analyze the chemical signatures of this preservation system. We can see the precise ratios, the specific herbs used, even traces of the pine tar that sealed the oak barrels. It's like finding a message from the medieval world, written in salt and herbs instead of ink and parchment. And that's not just archaeological curiosity. Today, when Scandinavians prepare gravlax or salt-cured ham, they are unconsciously performing rituals their ancestors developed for survival. The techniques haven't changed much, because they didn't need to change. Ragnar's proportions were essentially perfect for their intended purpose. Every time you see someone preparing cured salmon, every time you eat properly preserved meat, you're witnessing the legacy of a desperate young man who watched his sisters starve and swore an oath in blood to find a solution. The salt that saved Viking civilization continues to preserve not just food, but cultural memory itself. But I want to leave you with something even more profound. This story isn't really about salt, or preservation, or even Vikings. It's about what happens when individual desperation meets collective innovation. Ragnar didn't set out to transform medieval civilization. He just wanted to save his family. But his willingness to risk everything for that goal created ripples that are still spreading today. Think about the cascade of consequences. One man's blood oath led to preservation techniques that enabled longer sea voyages, which made possible the Viking expansion across the Quarters, North Atlantic, which eventually connected Europe to North America centuries before anyone else managed it. The settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, all of it traces back to that winter night when a dying father whispered about white gold from the sea. And consider the social revolution that followed. Women like Astrid Silverhands became master technicians, developing skills that were every bit as important as weaponcraft or shipbuilding. Children who would have died became warriors. Trading settlements grew into major cities. The entire economic foundation of Norse society shifted from raid and retreat to sustained territorial expansion. The enemies who tried to destroy the salt preservation revolution through poison and assassination thought they were stopping a technology. They didn't understand that they were fighting against the future itself. Once humans learned that they could control food spoilage, that they could store nutrition through winter and transport it across oceans, there was no going back. The knowledge was too valuable, too life-saving, too revolutionary to suppress. Each grain of salt that we use today carries within it the memory of that transformation. Each preserved piece of meat is a testament to one man's refusal to accept that winter had to mean death, that families had to watch children starve, that human beings had to remain prisoners of seasonal scarcity. Ragnar couldn't have known, as he mixed his blood with his father's and swore his desperate oath, that he was launching a revolution that would reshape civilization. He was just a son trying to honor his father's dying wish. But sometimes the most profound changes in human history begin with the simplest, most personal motivations. The salt that saved Viking civilization became the salt that enabled global exploration, global trade, and global culture. From a Norse longhouse in 872 after Christ to your dinner table tonight, the chain remains, unbroken. The preservation continues, not just of food, but of the human spirit that refuses to accept limits, that always seeks solutions, that turns desperate necessity into lasting innovation. That's the real legacy preserved forever, not just the techniques, but the reminder that individual acts of determination can echo through centuries, that solutions born from love and desperation can transform the world, and that sometimes the most important revolutions begin not with armies or kings, but with a young man watching his family starve and deciding that there has to be a better way. The winter of 872 had brought death to the fjords of western Norway, but it had also brought something else, the beginning of humanity's victory over seasonal scarcity, written in salt and sealed with blood, preserved forever in the memory of a world that salt helped to build.